Good day everyone, this is Kenny with another topic in STM 007 or General Biology 1. This time around, we are going to discuss active transport. But before we begin, let us have a short review of what we have discussed regarding passive transport. Now, when we speak of passive transport, ito yung type ng transport mechanism na ginagamit ng mga cell in order for the cell to have the influx of substances from the outside of the cell or kapag mag-exit palabas ng cell. Now, pag sinabi natin passive, we have two types. We have simple diffusion and we have facilitated diffusion. So when we speak of simple diffusion, this is the type of transport, passive transport to be specific. Ito yung type ng passive transport na kung saan the substances can go inside or outside the cell without the use of intermediary substances or nang walang kailangan na tulong. Samantalang pag sinabi naman natin na facilitated diffusion, coming from the word facile, which means to help, to assist, ito yung type ng passive transport na kung saan kinakailangan ng mga substances na dumaan through a tunnel or through a carrier protein para makapasok or makalabas ng cell. Ibig lang sabihin nun, kapag sinabi natin na passive transport, the substances are being delivered towards the cell or to the outside of the cell without the use of energy, without expending ATP. Now, when we speak of active transport naman, this is the type of movement of molecules across a cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. So, imagine this na lang. Sa isang room, nasa labas ka, so walang katao-tao sa labas. Pero sa loob ng room, maraming tao. Kasi nandun yung mga classmates mo. Remember, face-to-face. So, mula sa place na kung saan hindi ka kailangan mag-exert ng much effort para makapunta, which is the hallway, ngayon naman kailangan mong pumasok sa loob ng classroom na kung saan maraming tao at maraming upuan na nakaharang. So, you have to make your way through the room. You have to make your way through the crowded area. So, kailangan mong sumiksik-siksik or kailangan mong mag-adjust. So, kailangan mo talaga mag-exert ng effort in order for you to become assimilated dun sa place na kung saan mas marami yung tao or mas marami yung mga nakaharang na object. So, from lower concentration towards a higher concentration. Now, this is against the normal kasi ang normal, mula sa place na kung saan marami ang mga tao, pupunta sila ngayon sa mas konti in order for them to be equal para magkaroon ng equilibrium. Ngayon naman dito sa active transport, nangyayari siya kapag ang isang place or ang area ay nagmula sa wala or kokonti na tao papunta sa higher amount ng tao. Imagine again a concert hall or sa concert. Kadalasan yung mga tao nagkukumpul-kumpul sila sa may harapan, sa may malapit sa stage. So, ibig sabihin, mas marami ang spaces sa may likuran ng stage or sa may mas malayo na area sa stage. So, if you're going to walk to that place na kung saan medyo mas malayo ka pa sa stage, since mas kokonting tao, kokonti yung effort na kailangan mong exert para makadaan. Samantalang, if you're going to force your way towards the front of the concert, towards the stage, since mas marami ang tao doon, you will have to exert a lot of effort in order for you to be able to go there. So that is active transport. Rule number 1, from lower concentration towards the higher concentration. The other thing is, pag ang substance ay masyadong malaki para mag-fit doon sa plasma membrane or doon sa integral proteins ng cell membrane. Since the substance is too large in order for it to pass through the plasma membrane, kagaya ng water particles, kasi sa ating plasma membrane, merong mga maliliit na butas doon which we call aquaporins. Aqua meaning water, porins meaning pores or butas. So these are the pores or mga butas ng plasma membrane na kung saan pwedeng makadaan ang water. Or masyado siya malaki para mag-fit doon sa tunnel or para mag-fit doon sa mga carrier proteins ng integral proteins, which is for facilitated diffusion. So, yun yung sa active transport from area of lower concentration to higher concentration, or if the substance that is being ingested or being taken in or yung substance na expel ay masyadong malaki para mag-fit doon sa holes ng plasma membrane or sa ating integral proteins. So how does active transport work? So the proteins do much of the work in an active transport. Dahil dito sa mga proteins which are embedded in the plasma membrane, meron silang sariling mga receptors or yung nagre-receive ng signals. So ibig sabihin, signal specific or membrane specific yung mga substances natin in order for them to activate that form of transport. So they are positioned to cross the membrane. So one part is inside of the cell and the other part is outside. So ibig sabihin, it must pass through on both sides of the plasma membrane. So ate represents the ATP that is needed for the substance to go through the cell or to go out of the cell. So the example here is a sodium-potassium pump. Ano bang nangyayari sa sodium-potassium pump? Now, there is always an imbalance of potassium and sodium inside the cell. What needs to be done is for the potassium to go inside the cell, samantalang yung sodium kailangan niyang lumabas paalis ng cell. So what needs to happen? So una, we have to have our integral protein na kung saan connected siya inside and outside of the plasma membrane. Kagaya nito. So ito si integral protein natin. What will happen is that sodium ions, ito yung nasa loob ng cell, will fit towards the inside of the integral protein kasi diba sila, very specific sila kung sino lang yung makakapunta doon sa mga integral proteins natin at kung sino lang yung makapag-activate ng or kung sino lang yung makapag-activate ng mga integral proteins. So, the sodium-potassium pump binds the 3 sodium ions and the molecule of ATP. So, ito yung shape ng ating sodium, for example. So, this is for representation only. So, kasi para ipakita lang na very specific lang yung mga substances na pwede mag-activate ng mga integral proteins natin. So, 3 ang ions ng sodium na mafi-fit sa loob ng integral protein natin. And then, mag-a-attach ang ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate kasi 3 group ang kanyang phosphate group. So mag-a-attach ang ating ATP dito sa integral protein kapag nakapag-attach na rin yung sodium ions. Ngayon naman, the splitting of ATP provides the energy to change the shape of the channel. So mula sa ang kanyang opening ay nasa loob ng cell, ngayon naman because of the action of the adenosine triphosphate, ma-activate ngayon yung shape or ma-change yung shape ng integral protein, ang kanya magiging opening ay papunta sa labas. Ngayon naman kapag nasa papunta na sa labas, yung ating integral protein, ito na ngayon, pwede na makapasok ngayon yung potassium ions to fill in the gap dito sa loob ng integral protein. So the sodium ions will be released to the outside of the membrane. So ma-release na ngayon yung sodium ions. Tapos ngayon naman kapag na-release na, mag-change shape uli itong integral protein natin. Mula sa palabas, magiging papasok na uli yung kanyang shape. So kapag naging papasok na uli yung kanyang shape, yung potassium ion naman will be released towards the inside of the cell. Now, the release of the phosphate allows the channel to revert to its original form, releasing the potassium ions to the inside of the membrane. So, dito sa sodium-potassium pump natin, 3 sodium ions from the inside of the cell, with the use of the ATP, ma-release yan ngayon towards the outside of the cell, na kung saan kapag na-release na yan, yung ating potassium ion naman will be released towards the inside of the cell. So, bakit nga ba importante itong sodium-potassium pump? Yung sodium kasi, it is important dahil siya yung isa sa mga nagre-regulate ng water content ng cell. Remember, nung sinabi natin during our discussion, the water will always follow the salt. Wherever the salt goes, susunod yung water. The salt is composed of sodium and chlorine. Now, sodium is one of those components. Kapag nirelease na kasi yung sodium mula sa loob ng cell papunta sa labas, what will happen is that kapag masyado na mataas yung water content ng cell, susunod siya doon sa sodium. Okay? Kaya mababawasan yung water content ng cell. So it is important for the water regulation or the fluid regulation of the cell. So aside from the sodium-potassium pump, meron din tayong another specific example of active transport. And this is called bulk transport or vesicular transport. It is called bulk transport or vesicular transport because we have to make use of vesicles. Now, there are two types. We have pinocytosis or phagocytosis, wherein pinocytosis means, pino means fluid or liquid, cytosis, cyto means cell, is ang dulo, so it is a process. So, pinocytosis is the process of the cell wherein it takes in the fluid or the solute which is dissolved in the fluid. When we speak of phagocytosis naman, phago means eat, cyto means cell, sys means it is a process. So this is the process of the cell wherein it eats large substances such as bacteria kung sakaling kakainin niya yung bacteria. So how does this work? Meron tayong mga receptors which can be found on our plasma membrane. It could be the glycoproteins which is embedded in the proteins ng plasma membrane. So they act as receptors. Ngayon naman, kung sakali na meron silang substances na kailangang i-intake sa loob ng cell, these receptors will try to detect these substances na kailangan niya. And then once detected, mag-a-attach yung mga specific molecule doon sa receptors which will now trigger the plasma membrane to start to create a furrow. So ito yung furrow, magka-create siya ng furrow para magkaroon ng space na papasukan yung fluid para ma-intake nila or para ma-intake ng cell yung substances na kailangan niya. Now once the furrow has been completed, ang mangyayari ngayon ay magdidikit ngayon yung itong magkabilaan na plasma membrane. Tapos, the furrow will now produce what we call a vesicle. Ito yung vesicle natin ngayon. So, from the outside of the cell, with the use of energy, by expending energy, nagkakaroon ng intake ng mga malalaking substances na hindi kayang dumaan sa ating plasma membrane or through our integral proteins. Ang ginagamit ngayon ng cell natin kasi masyadong malaki yung mga substances is vesicular transport or bulk transport. Okay? So kapag sinabi natin na pinocytosis, it is the fluid or cell drinking. Kapag sinabi naman natin na phagocytosis, it is eating or cell eating. So bakit nga ba importante itong ating active transport? So this is important because some molecules transported towards the cell or away from the cell are charged. So meron silang mga charges kaya hindi sila basta-basta na nakakapasok. Kasi remember, our plasma membrane is composed of hydrophilic head and hydrophobic tail. So, ibig sabihin, hindi basta-basta makakapasok yung mga charged substances. So, one way of transporting these substances na may charges is through active transport, kagaya nung sa ating sodium-potassium pump. What about sa mga pagkain ng mga bacteria if they are going to eat or if they are going to drink? So, ito yung ginagamit nila. They make use of bulk transport or vesicular transport. So, ito yung pag-intake ng mga substances from the outside towards the inside of the cell. So, ano ba yung mga iba-ibang substances na nahihirapan na i-transport sa loob ng cell? So, it has to make use of energy para maipasok yung mga substances na yun or mailabas yung mga substances na yun mula sa cell. So, ang example dito ay sodium, potassium, amino acids, and glucose. Of course, glucose, importante siya because it is the source of energy of the cell. So, yung sodium naman, bakit? Kasi it is used to balance the water level in the body. Remember, kapag ang salt natin ay mas mataas ang concentration, the water will follow it because wherever the salt goes, the water will follow. So, kailangan siya ng pang-balance ng ating water level sa katawan. Kasi kapag masyadong mataas ang salt content natin sa katawan, of course, ma-retain yung water sa katawan natin, mas mataas yung tsansa na mas magiging overweight ka or mas magiging mataba ka. Kasi na-retain yung water sa loob ng cell. What about yung mga amino acids or proteins na masyadong malaki or complex para basta nila makapasok sa loob ng cell? Kailangan silang i-transport papasok ng cell kasi kailangan niya for growth and repair. Proteins are needed for the growth and repair of the cell. Hindi lang yon, marami ang function ng proteins. Ginagamit din siya as hormone, ginagamit din siya as structure. Potassium naman, kailangan siya para magkaroon ng effective muscle function because our muscle and our neuron are easily excitable. Kailangan na mas mababa yung charges or mas mababa yung positive charge sa loob ng cell as compared sa labas para maging excitable yung mga cells natin in order for these types of cell to function properly. Kung sakali na pantay yung charges, parehong equally positive or equally negative yung charges sa loob ng cell at sa labas, there could be problems. We have talked about endocytosis, which is pinocytosis and phagocytosis. Endo means to enter the cell. Now we talk about exocytosis, or the process wherein substances are expelled away from the cell. So, how do we do this? Opposite lang siya ng ating endocytosis. So, for example, ng exocytosis, meron tayong mga waste materials or yung cell natin na produce siya ng specific hormone, kagaya ng growth hormone, kagaya ng testosterone, kagaya ng luteinizing hormone. So, those are the types of hormone which is produced inside the cell. Ngayon naman, kailangan nating ilabas yung mga hormones na yun palabas ng cell para magamit ng katawan natin, para ma-absorb siya ng different parts of the body natin kung saan siya kailangan. So, mula sa loob ng cell, gagamit siya uli ng vesicle. So, this is the vesicle. Now, the vesicle has the same makeup ng plasma membrane. So, kung ano yung plasma membrane natin, ganun din yung shape and structure ng ating mga vesicles. So, ang gagawin lang yan is it will attach to the plasma membrane. And kapag nag-attach na siya, it will now become fused to become a part of the plasma membrane. Kapag na-fuse na yan, of course, the substances which are inside the vesicle will become released. It will be released towards the outside of the cell. Now, the cell has to do this by expending energy. Okay, so this is still a part of active transport. Ginagamit ang exocytosis in times na kung saan masyadong marami ang substances sa loob ng cell, na kung saan it could be harmful to the cell. Ginagamit siya ng cell natin in order to remove waste materials away from the body, kagaya ng mga nitrogenous waste materials. Kasi diba kapag nagkakaroon ng process, there is a byproduct ng waste materials, kailangang i-expel yun kasi it is harmful to the cell. Another example is yung mga hormones na pinoproduce ng cell natin. It has to release these hormones towards the outside of the cell para mag-mix siya sa blood, tapos ma-transport yung mga hormones na yon to the parts of the body na kung saan siya kailangan. Okay, so that is active transport. It makes use of ATP in order for the transport to happen. Examples of this is the sodium-potassium pump or the bulk transport. Bulk transport or vesicular transport. Under bulk transport, there are two types. We have endocytosis, wherein substances will be taken in towards the cell, and exocytosis, exo meaning exit. The substances will be expelled away from the cell or towards the outside of the cell. Okay, so that's it for module number 15, which is about active transport.